So my name's Richard Rouse. I'm a designer at Microsoft, currently working on the State of Decay game and also with the ID at Xbox program, if anyone has questions about that in the talk room later. And today we're talking about Death to the Three-Act Structure toward a unique structure for game narratives.
Indeed, I am Tom Abernathy, as most of you probably heard more often than you want to know by now. I'm the narrative lead at Riot Games. I've worked on Halo Reach, The Saboteur, Destroy All Humans, currently League of Legends, and perhaps other things going on in Riot. And what we want to talk about today is the challenge of applying Hollywood three-act structure in a game's context, a game narrative context, and some potential approaches to these challenges. Toward a unique structure for game narratives, says our subtitle. But first, just to make sure we're all on the same page, let's talk about why structure matters. Well, the pictures on the previous slide of the Dread Pirate Roberts and Inigo Montoya, those characters were dreamed up by a gentleman named William Goldman, novelist and playwright, screenwriter, I should say. He wrote The Princess Bride novel and screenplay, also won Oscars for Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid and a ton of other stuff. One of the great screenwriters ever, and he's known for a couple of very pithy quotes about Hollywood, but one of them is, "Screenplays are structure." Now, the thing is, that's a truism, unfortunately, that causes pain to pretty much everybody who tries to tell stories well in linear media, because structure is hard. The problem is that thousands of years of verbal, written, performed film storytelling pretty much demonstrate that solid dramatic structure really does make a story more satisfying. And in film terms, really, if you get that right, you can get a whole lot of other things wrong, and it won't really matter. Now, you've probably seen some graphical representations of story structure in various contexts before. If you're like me, you may have seen this one in a book of short stories in middle school, the one with the telltale heart and occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge and that sort of thing. Maybe yours used the word exposition for the first part. Maybe it said setting in characters. I always did like the word denouement from the end personally. Maybe it used the word complication. Don't worry, by the way, none of this stuff is on the test. It'll all be on the vault. And maybe you've even heard of something called Freytag's Triangle, which is an analysis by a 19th century German novelist and playwright named Gustav Freytag. Looks pretty similar in most ways to those, embellishes on the verbiage a bit. The specifics here aren't really important. What matters is that the idea of an ideal story structure has actually been around for a very long time, and as a matter of fact, a lot longer than the middle of the 19th century. What Freytag was actually analyzing was something much older, something you may have heard of, even if you don't necessarily know completely what it is, and that is the thing called three-act structure. Three-act structure predates Hollywood. That would shock some people from Hollywood. It goes back at least as far as 300 BC, and Aristotle, the little gentleman down there on the left, in his Poetics, he asserted that the ideal story had three parts: protasis, epitasis, and catastrophe. Now, I don't speak Greek, but I'm reliably informed that those words don't mean a whole lot more than beginning, middle, and end. And the fact is that at least since Aristotle, people have analyzed story in every medium, theater, fiction, film, etc., to try to figure out that medium's optimal story structure, or, if it can be found. Now, when the Hollywood trailblazers of yore, and I'm talking about, say, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, asked the same question, what are the important parts of story structure? They came up with something revolutionary. Okay, that may be a little reductive. One of my favorite film analysts and story analysts, film crit Hulk on Badass Digest, puts it like this. He calls, instead of beginning, middle, and end, he calls the parts setup, confrontation, and resolution. They are punctuated by what in Hollywood are called plot points, events that alter the course of the story. If any of you have ever heard of Sid Field, who is sort of the prototypical screenwriting guru, he embellished the paradigm a bit and is the guy who sort of popularized the notion, I think, of the whole Hollywood three-act structure thing. He added other terms like inciting incident, which is the event that sort of kicks off the crisis or central conflict of the plot, and pinch, which are the events at the quarter and three-quarter marks of Act Two that ratchet up the stakes in some way. By the way, you may notice that, in fact, Hollywood three-act structure kind of looks like four-act structure in some ways. You might think that's a little weird. I've always thought it was a little weird. I don't have a really good explanation for it, except that the notion of three acts from Aristotle is actually pretty pervasive, and that's probably why people think of it that way. But in terms of time, it really is almost more of a four-act structure. Because the fact of the matter is Act 2 takes twice as long as Acts 1 and 3. Now, other people have done their own analyses, but the basic shapes of the triangle, right, the rising and falling action, all that kind of stuff if you chart it on the y-axis, have pretty much always been the same. Note, by the way, that each of these analyses treats plot as the driving consideration. That makes sense. They're analyzing story structure. For our purposes, though, in our talk, Richard and I are going to treat plot as something distinct from the words story or narrative. When you hear us use those words, what we mean is not so much plot per se, we mean something more like fictional context. That may seem like an esoteric distinction, but in fact it's going to be pretty important in a minute. Now, very briefly, I want to apply this paradigm to a movie that we all know and love. No, I'm kidding. I'm not going to use Star Wars. Are you kidding me? Everybody uses Star Wars. I'm going to use Toy Story because that's more fun.
Good choice.
Everybody pretty much in here, I expect, has seen Toy Story, so let's use that instead, and we'll use the Sid Field diagram as our map. At the beginning of Act 1 of Toy Story, Woody is the leader of the toys in Andy's room. The inciting incident is that Andy gets a new toy at his birthday party. Buzz Lightyear, yay! All the toys are dazzled except for Woody. He gets jealous. That's plot point 1, and it propels us into Act 2, because the question is, oops, sorry, look at that, that happens. That tells us what's going to happen. I'm just trying to go down on my notes. Thank you. So, Act 2, Woody tries to get rid of Buzz, and that pisses off all the other toys. Mom takes the kids to Pizza Planet, she stops for gas, and then she drives away while Woody and Buzz are arguing. Now Woody and Buzz are alone, out in the wider world, separated from Andy and the other toys. The stakes have been ratcheted. That is pinch 1. They make it to Pizza Planet. They end up getting pulled out of the claw machine by Sid, who takes them home to play, if you will. And that's the midpoint. As is often the case in a comedy or an action film, that's pretty much a low point of the movie in a lot of ways. Now, Woody and Buzz realize they're in deep trouble. The toys in Sid's room are very scary. Sid actually tortures Woody with a magnifying glass. Buzz sees a TV commercial advertising Buzz Lightyear toys. He realizes he may not be a real space ranger after all. He tries to fly, jumps off the banister, falls down, breaks his arm. Stakes have been ratcheted again. That's pinch 2. So now Woody and Buzz are both mired in existential crisis. I was supposed to put that on. And they have something in common now, because they're both in existential crisis mode. And that's awesome, but Sid decides he's going to strap one of them to a bottle rocket and basically blow them up, and that's not so awesome. Oh, and by the way, Andy's family is moving today, if I didn't mention that before, and that's important because the moving van is coming, and that's what we call a ticking clock, because if Woody and Buzz can't escape Sid before Andy's family leaves for the new house, they're going to lose their kid forever. That is their most low point of all. Plot point 2, propelling us into Act 3. We have the escape from Sid's house in Act 3. Woody and Buzz and Sid's toys come alive. They freak the hell out of Sid, which is awesome. But the moving truck and Mom's car leave for the new house without them. Not so awesome. Woody and Buzz chase the moving truck and Mom's car using RC. They fly into the sky using the bottle rocket. They fall with style back into the minivan right next to Andy. And basically everybody's happy. That's the end of the movie. So as you can see, the template of Hollywood 3-act structure maps pretty well to Toy Story. But don't get the wrong idea. The fact of the matter is not all movies do, and they don't even have to. Because contrary to the way some people talk about Hollywood 3-act structure, it's not a formula for success. It's not something that you should be slavishly adhering to with every movie. Just like Aristotle's Poetics, it's really just an analysis of the sort of structure that has often seemed to work pretty well in Hollywood commercial film storytelling. But the question for us is, does it also work pretty well in games?
And I do have an example of a game that uses 3-act structure pretty well, about as well as a game can, and that's Uncharted 2, Among Thieves. And this, I think, is a pretty good 3-act structure. You note if I've had to take the 3-act structure chart that Tom was using and stretch it out quite a bit. Now we have just about 1 to 2 hour Act 1 and a 1 to 2 hour Act 3, but then like a 10 to 12 hour Act 2 in the middle of them. It works pretty well, has a little issue with sometimes you don't always remember what the point of everything you're doing is, but it mostly holds together. And the people at Naughty Dog did a really good job of thinking of ways to help make this work. So, for example, they do a great in media res start, where you start on that train hanging off the cliff at the beginning, and that's actually part of the middle of the story. But they put it at the beginning to have a big action opening like you want to have in a rollicking action game like Uncharted versus, you know, a traditional Hollywood structure that would start slower with setting up the plot. And so they go through that action sequence before then flashing back to when the story actually starts. You know, something that's a little more problematic is it seems like they really tried to have that low point of Act 2 that Tom mentions happened in Toy Story. And there's a whole section towards the second half of Act 2 where Nathan Drake is questioning his purpose and whether he wants to go on or not, and having this sort of existential crisis. The problem being the player at this point in the game is like, they're pretty far into the game, they're driving towards the end, they're like, Nate, what are you talking about? I want to keep playing this game, I don't want to stop, that's crazy. So, you know, it creates a little bit of a conflict, right, between what the player wants to do, you know, keep playing the game, versus what the player character in the game is like, oh, I don't know if I want to do this anymore. However, you know, the thing works pretty darn well, you know, buoyed by the great love triangle between Chloe and Elena and Nate, and the great scenes that are written with them. It sort of keeps things interesting regardless.
So we see that the game that probably does Hollywood 3-act structure as well as it can be done in games still maybe doesn't fit perfectly. Is there a better model? Well, let's look at serialized television. And just to quickly explain terms, serialized TV is distinct from what we call episodic TV, which is what they used to do. Some broadcast shows still do this, where every episode is basically a self-contained plot for the most part, right? So they could rerun it, they could syndicate it, you could see it by itself or out of order and it wouldn't confuse you. Serialized storytelling, instead, is storytelling that happens over longer periods than just one episode, right? And starting with Hill Street Blues in the 80s and Oz in the 90s, and then really getting amped up with The Sopranos, there's been a resurgence, particularly over the last 15 years, of long-form serialized storytelling on television, particularly on the premium pay cable networks and, to some degree, basic cable. Now, this could be relevant for game storytellers, because showrunners have to break story for structure on every level of magnification. They have to think about structure of scenes. They have to think about the sequences that scenes make up. They have to think about the acts, which are the things when you watch a show that the commercials punctuate, basically. They have to think about perhaps half-season or even full-season arcs, like we've seen recently on Breaking Bad or on The Wire. They have to think perhaps about multi-season story arcs on shows like Game of Thrones. And if they're really working at it hard, maybe they even think about whole series arcs, as with Mad Men, where the creator, Matthew Weiner, has said that he's actually had the end point of the series in mind for quite a long time, if not quite from the very beginning of the show. This ability to design story structure at various levels of magnification may scale more effectively, actually, for our purposes as game storytellers. There is one property that's gotten a lot of attention and succeeded in multiple media as a graphic novel, a TV show, and a game, and that is The Walking Dead.
So The Walking Dead is I think, almost inarguably certainly most financially successful episodically released game that focuses on narrative that's come out so far. And because the team would release an episode, a 2-hour episode or so, every 2 months, they had to have a pretty complete storytelling experience within each episode to leave players feeling some level of satisfaction. So they would introduce characters for each of those different episodes that would then, you know, have their own little arc within that, and then would often resolve by the end and then be gone from the game after that. Obviously, the whole time you also had Clem and Lee going through the whole thing on their own arc, building over the whole series of episodes, the serialized story that they were telling that led up to the episode 5, which largely focused on them. And I think this worked really well, obviously. You know, another game that does this, interestingly, though, is The Last of Us. Now, The Last of Us was not released episodically, but it has a very serialized story within it, right? It has, if we look at it, there are these different characters that come in and out of the story at different places and leave you with, you know, a pretty satisfying chunk of story with Ellie and Joel being a constant throughout. So if we actually break down that story a little bit, like on this chart, you'll see I've got the y-axis in there to represent rising action over the totality of the story, but you'll see within it we have those individual spikes. Those are those complete things that feel like a good episode of a TV show or something like that. It gives you, you know, something that rises to climax and then resolves by the end. But yet the whole thing is going up over time as we see Ellie and Joel's story moving to its inevitable conclusion. I think you could superimpose 3-act structure onto this in some way if you wanted, because you can kind of superimpose 3-act structure onto whatever you want. But I think really clearly this is much more of a serial story, like with the TV example. And Neil Druckmann, the writer of the game, has actually said that as he's talked about it. We're not the first people to suggest that this is a great way to structure a longer form game. In fact, at last GDC Next, it was last fall, Jeremy Bernstein, who's in the audience with us here today and doing a talk, I believe tomorrow, is it? Anyway, later in the Narrative Summit, he did a great talk about sequence structure. And this is basically the idea, Hollywood has had this idea of one of their many structure formulas being sequences. And these are 15-minute chunks that each have some sort of interesting revelation to the story, whether it's resolving its own subplot or just, having a twist and complications for the main story. And he said in his talk that this was an excellent way to think about game structure, because you can sort of superimpose these sequences onto the level of your game. So you can have a little sequence in each level, so the player is constantly getting some sort of narrative drive as they move on. And he talks about in the talk how he applied this to Dead Space 2. The trick here a little bit is that he talked about in the talk how it's important that these be 15-minute chunks, because that's about what the human brain can handle. Though even in something like The Last of Us, the chunks are actually much bigger. They're like 60 to 90 to 120 minutes, which, has some issues of its own. But it's an excellent talk. I encourage you to go check it out on the Vault. Interestingly, though, at the end of his talk, someone asked him the question, well, how does this work for open world games? What happens when the player has control over what order they do the missions in, right? And interestingly, he had a slide prepared for this question and brought it up at the time. And he basically says, I don't really think it does work. Narrative structurally, I don't really, those aren't my favorite games. And it's true. How can rising narrative work in these experiences? Like if we map this onto something like Fallout 3 here, you'll see I've got the very short part 1 with that time in the vault, very short part 3 at the end with Project Purity mission that completes the main quest. But this giant time in the middle where I don't know what order the player is going to do these missions in. I don't know which missions they're even going to do because they can skip a lot of them. So it doesn't look like structure is really working here, and certainly the game writer's control over it is greatly diminished. And yet, if you talk to people about stories and games, they'll often say that these RPGs are some of their favorite story game experiences. People love these things, right, for their story. And why is that?
Why indeed, Richard? If any of you were here for Deb Henderson's talk earlier today, then you will have seen some of this data. It's very pertinent to our subject, because she discovered, as she talked about, that players really hardly remember the specific plots of the games they play. When they were asked, tell me the plot of your favorite movie, they did it at length and very accurately. Tell me the plot of your favorite game, or excuse me, favorite TV show. They did it at length, very accurately. Tell me the plot of your favorite game. Not so much at length, not so accurate. And the chart here reproduces the thing she may have used in her own, I don't remember, that talks about how many words they use in their description. That's the objective measure that she used to sort of draw this conclusion from.
Interestingly, though, as she said in her talk earlier, she found that players were able to remember characters in the games really well, actually. As she says here in finding number 2, game characters were consistently remembered, though not necessarily for their role in the plot. Instead, characterization appeared memorable. Players also remembered really well, gameplay events that were tied directly to plot. I think, and some people say, well, why aren't players remembering our plots very well? Some people might say, well, it's because we haven't figured it out yet. And I would say, well, we've been spending 30 years on it with a lot of really smart people, a lot of whom are in this room. And I think the reason that we haven't figured it out yet is a more fundamental problem. For one, I think when players are playing a game, they are very engaged in the gameplay. They're using their brains on that, right? They have to. They can't progress through the game if they don't work on solving those problems. Second of all, game narrative is almost always extremely spaced out. There might be ongoing narrative, like, say, a character companion that you're with, and those are the people you might remember. But the twists and plot turns that come in every 90 minutes or so, they're like this thing that happens before you get back to playing the game, and you're more likely to forget about it, not put it together with the other pieces. In essence, lose the whole thing. So I think if you have a very simple plot that hews closely to your gameplay challenges that you're putting in front of the player, okay, I think players could remember that pretty well. I think if you have a more complex plot, you're probably screwed.
And here's another nail in the coffin of this idea of game structure being particularly meaningful. Statistically, most players don't finish games. We know that. I mean, we've all seen numbers that say something like a third on average. But even look at this list of actually very popular narrative-based games, right? Look at the drop-off between Walking Dead Episode 1 and Episode 5. Look at the drop-off between Mass Effect 2 and Mass Effect 3. Look at Portal. which is a 5-hour game. It's not that long. Everybody loves it. Everybody thinks it's amazing. And yet, fewer than half of the people who played Portal actually finished it. So the question is, how much does the third act pay off that you're putting so much work into as you're trying to structure your plot intricately? How much does that matter if the fact is that the majority of your players are never even going to see it? Can they still like and get something out of my story, even if they never see the ending?
And this gets even more interesting as we start looking at some of the other games that people cite as, their favorite game stories of all time, right? If we look at Portal, right? I think by now, I hope everyone is familiar with this story of you learning about GLaDOS and what a crazy AI she is. And if you look at the structure of this, it really doesn't have really plot twists or changes. It's really the whole story is just revealing GLaDOS's personality as she starts out as someone who's just testing you and then moves to, oh, she's kind of crazy, to, oh, weird, she put me in a live fire demo, to, oh, she's making me incinerate a companion cube, to, oh, she's trying to incinerate me, right? It just kind of, none of these things come as a great shock because it's just this very gradual reveal of her character. It's more of a character study, really, than a conventional Hollywood plot. Let's look at another example from BioShock 2. Now, BioShock 2 is one of my favorite game stories. It has to do with your relationship with this daughter figure and how the choices you make in the game determine how she's going to evolve as a person and the choices she's going to make. And I asked Jordan Thomas, who is the creative director and writer on this game, what he was thinking about structure when he wrote this. And here's the answer he gave. I deliberately wanted to make it feel like protagonism, and by extent structure, was melting down. All along it was Eleanor's story in response to yours, and as such, protagonism was transferred. The story had been transferred and would outlive you. Her Act 3 takes place outside the game. You ultimately have to let her and the structure go. Now, if you know Jordan, this is a predictably sort of mind-melting answer, and if you want to go analyze this later and see how this quote applies to it, I encourage you to do so. But it's interesting that in order to tell the story he wanted to tell, he had to deliberately subvert structure and sort of throw it away. And speaking of throwing away structure, if we look at some of the recent indie games that have been very popular and praised for their stories, I think you'll find that they don't have anything like a conventional structure either. I think like the story that unfolds in Papers, Please is so integrated into the gameplay that you kind of don't even realize it's happening in Stanley Parable. Well, that's a Stanley Parable. When we were talking about doing this talk, we said, hey, let's do a talk about how 3-act structure isn't right, and let's propose a new structure that might work, right? So death to the 3-act structure toward a unique structure for game narratives. Well, unfortunately, while working on this, we realized, maybe that's not what we're going to do. And instead, we've come up with it. I think we're going to be a little more bold and say, William Goldman doesn't work in the game industry. Game stories are not about structure. And as we tried to think of a globally applicable game structure, we just couldn't come up with one.
So let's talk about what we do think the proper conclusions from all this stuff are. First of all, in games, plot is highly overrated. I've been thinking this for a long time, actually, but I was really gratified to see data that backed it up. The user research accumulated by Deb Henderson and Microsoft User Research proves that out. Players don't remember plot. What they do remember is they remember characters. They hook emotionally into characters, and both player characters and NPCs really are the things that they come away caring about. And they also care about their own user experience. So when you're thinking about what to do for your game story, it makes sense then to focus on the things that they will retain, that are going to be most important to them in the long run. Focus on character, but make sure the character's motivations are aligned with the motivations you're leading the player to experience as well. A seamless marriage of those things is going to satisfy them, delight them, stick with them for a lot longer than your plot ever will. In the same vein, you want to make sure that your story is aligned with the structural needs of your game's design, not just in the user experience, but also in design aspects like the learn, practice, master loop, the level design, the mission design. And to the extent that you do build out a plot, you want to pay very close attention to the needs of those design elements and construct the dramatic rhythms of the experience to support them and be in concert with them rather than to be conflicting with them.
And I challenge everybody here to think about, your own stories in games that you've really loved, the ones that you remember the most fondly. And I suspect that if you do that, you'll realize you're remembering more of the characters you got to spend a lot of time with, or the unique worlds that they were in, more than you'll remember the plot. Even for games that have really good structures like these, I think you're going to end up remembering those characters and worlds a lot more. And, you know, chances are the story you may be thinking of, again, as we pointed out today, does not have a conventional structure in any normal sense. So it's my hope that today, you know, that we've managed to provide enough evidence that we've convinced some of the hardcore structuralists in the audience to see that this is a medium where structure is not king. And for those of you who already agree with us, I hope this talk has given you ammunition so that the next time some fool comes into your office waving the latest, trendiest, sexiest screenplay structure book and saying, this will make our story better, you can go and tell them that you went to GDC and heard two guys boldly proclaim death to the 3-act structure. Not that bold.
That's
Thank
it.
you.
Thanks.